not to look racist in Edwardian clothes. First, avoid wearing racist political symbols.
Like this?
No, like that sash.
But this is a women's suffrage sash.
You know the gold stripe on that sash represents an 1867 referendum where women's suffrage leaders worked with openly white supremacist politicians to get votes for white women at the expense of black people?
Oh. Hi, I'm V. I am a self-taught dress history nerd, and as previously stated, firm believer that my feminism will be intersectional or it will be bullshit. Hence the sequel to my previous video about why the suffragette white dresses and sashes are maybe not the feminist icon of costuming that we should be trying to emulate. With me here today, I have my dear friend, Ora Lin.
Hi, I'm Ora. I make historical and vintage costuming content on YouTube and on Instagram, and also general educational content on racism and various social issues.
There's this thing I've noticed in a lot of fashion history where it's looking at just the history of aesthetics and we're not looking at the symbolism. That's missing a lot because that is what makes clothes a significant form of social history. When we talked about the suffragette stuff, those colors were chosen for a very specific reason.
Clothing has always been something that has been used to show class separation and sometimes race separation. It's the first thing you might notice about someone when you see them. It has a huge impact on the way that people interact and the way that people view each other, and ways to uphold and to show participation in social constructs.
People wear this to tell you this is who I am. A really easy way to describe this sort of symbolism and our understanding that, like, when we see somebody in a specific historical outfit, especially one that has a political meaning, we're going to either think that they agree with that set of politics or they are portraying someone who agrees with that set of politics, is if you see somebody in a Nazi uniform. You're going to assume that either they are a neo-Nazi or they are portraying the historical figure of a Nazi. You're not gonna look at that and think you can separate that from the politics. On some level, we understand this concept of, like, when you see something that has that political symbolism attached, you can't just take a Nazi uniform and be like, oh, but this is just about the colors. But we see people trying to do that all the time with other forms of historical costume. Maybe it's not something as obvious as a military uniform, but things with political symbolism like the suffragette sashes.
Yeah, there's always going to be politics and going to be ideas, and especially with historical dress, you're bringing in the historical context by wearing historical dress.
Exactly.
There's this weird disconnect in a lot of places that we've seen, historical sites, plantations, where people fully intellectually disconnect from the context and just want to have this fantasy and just have a good time without thinking about the meaning of what they're participating in. Hey, notice how V's picture quality is way nicer than usual?
Well, that is thanks to this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes for creative, curious people like you. I have always admired Ora's camera work, so I asked them to help me choose a Skillshare class on basic filmography.
Filmmaking Techniques, Camera Settings for Storytelling by Sean Dykink is a course that breaks down all of the basic camera settings that you need to start taking really gorgeous and intentional cinematography. I love this class and I think it does a wonderful job of illustrating how all of these settings work and how you can use them to your advantage.
I shot my last video on manual. I'm shooting this on manual. That's never happened before. I did not expect to be somebody who makes videos. Classes like this are how I'm training myself to have a new job. And Skillshare has thousands upon thousands of classes on everything from professional skills like filmography, like search engine optimization, to personal pursuits like embroidery and houseplant care. The first 1,000 people to use the link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. The link is in the description. So the suffragette movement is a weirdly good example of one of these outfits that has such a place in our modern imagination, but people are not really familiar with a lot of the politics beyond, oh, they advocated for women to have votes. In 1913, there was this really big women's suffrage march on the US Capitol. There were people traveling from all over the country to be part of this thing. The woman who was doing the organizing, Alice Paul, tried to say, I'm not racist, but all the black women should march at the back. She was pretty sure that the Southern suffrage delegations were going to pull out of the march if the black women were there.
I think this is a demonstration of trying to get the support of racist people by enforcing racism. You can't just say, I'm not racist, and then do racism, which that clearly was.
Yeah. There's this paper that I've read and these sources that contrast Alice Paul's memories of how this went over with Ida B. Wells. And Ida B. Wells was like, are you kidding me? No, I'm marching with my organization. I don't care if you make me start the parade at the back. By the end of this march, I will be marching with my local delegation.
Around this same time, you have a lot of the entertainment and a lot of the media is pushing these racial stereotypes. The Mammy stereotype, The Birth of a Nation, which came out in 1915, that had white people in blackface committing violence, committing sexual assault, and that was their entire role.
The thing that stands out to me so much about the white dresses and that makes me so uncomfy with suffragettes' idea of we're gonna be really, really aggressively white feminine, we're gonna look pure and virtuous, and we're gonna make men look bad for putting their hands on us to arrest us. This same ideal of white femininity was being used as the initiating point or justification for lynch mobs. They would be like, oh, this black person looked at a white woman. Well, now we're gonna have to do all sorts of mob violence.
Both the ideas about white women being delicate and needing to be protected and ideas about people of color, and specifically black people, being violent and being less evolved all go back to Darwinism, and he was pushing ideas that women were less evolved, were less intelligent than men, and also pushing ideas that indigenous people around the world and people of color were also less evolved and less intelligent. It's interesting how these things work together because the white women were weaponizing this construct that puts them down to put other people down.
Like, smash the patriarchy? Oh no, we'll keep the patriarchy. We just want to make sure that we're at the top of the pyramid.
It's a difference between what we now refer to as white mainstream or BuzzFeed feminism versus intersectional feminism. BuzzFeed feminism focuses on equality to an oppressor and usually focuses on individual empowerment and individual achievement, whereas intersectional feminism focuses on liberation from an oppressor. These white women were looking for equality to white men. They didn't want liberation from the system. Maybe they did, but what they were using as a tool was buying into the system.
Maybe some of them did, but the movement as a whole didn't.
Yeah, they were actively participating in the oppressive system that called them weak and called them unintelligent, and pushing the same system on people of color. The more modern BuzzFeed feminism, a lot of white women don't shave their legs, which if you didn't know, beauty ideals about body hair are also very racially based, and white women trying to, I don't even think it came from white women. This is going back to Darwinism, but white women trying to separate themselves more from women of color. Not all women of color, but a lot of women of color tend to have a little bit more body hair, so they were like, if we shave our legs and our armpits and everything else, then we can have more separation and more racism and have a beauty ideal that women of color can't fit into or have to do more work to fit into. This is really interesting because now you have white women who don't shave, but then the reality is, and there was a huge discussion on feminist TikTok about this a little while ago, that a lot of women of color don't have the privilege of being able to do that and being able to not wear makeup and not do their hair because they will have a much harder time just going throughout their day-to-day life because of discrimination.
Yeah.
So it has a huge effect on the way that they walk through life if they put effort into meeting these beauty standards. Going back to the suffragettes, they were pushing these ideals with their white dresses and with their white femininity, and it just increased racism.
So what that reminds me a lot of is for people of color, it's like the more flavors of oppression that you stack on top of each other, the steeper, like exponentially steeper the consequences get. In the case of the suffragettes, you have these white women who were getting arrested, who were going on hunger strikes, who were being imprisoned. They were not always kind to these white women because these white women were stepping out of line. Imagine how these same institutions, these same police would have treated black women, women of color, under these same circumstances.
Our government has a history of assassinating black people for advocating for their own life. I mean, I don't know, were any of the suffragettes assassinated for advocating for their rights?
I don't believe they were assassinated, no. I mean, somebody did die very famously by accident, but nobody was, I believe, assassinated on purpose. And like, we hear about the level of brutality that the police treat black people with to this day. after 2 civil rights movements.
You talked about in your other video how originally the women's suffrage movement and the slavery abolition movement were one and the same, and they split.
Yeah, so in the first half of the 19th century in the US, there was this coalition of women and black folks who were going for universal suffrage and abolition.
And it split.
The split happened because black men were offered suffrage and white women were not. I'm not going to say all of the black male abolitionists were firm believers in women's suffrage, but enough of them were that they were like, okay, we're going to take this and keep fighting. We still want universal suffrage. The white women's suffrage leaders were like, no, anything that doesn't include us isn't worth having. They relied on a load of racist dog whistles and language to express their point.
The difference between reform and abolition, in theory, reform could work, but the reality of what we've seen is that it doesn't. We know that this country was founded on colonialism and racism. And the thing about trying to reform it is that it can't happen fast enough, and the people who built it on these ideals are continuing to push them. And we see that to this day. We see huge amounts of anti-LGBTQ legislation and legislation about people with uteruses' bodily autonomy.
We've got sexism and medical agency and religious freedom that this is all trespassing against because I'm Jewish. Terminating a pregnancy is not only permitted but encouraged in many situations according to Jewish religious law.
I think what people get wrong about reform is that you can't have people in power who uphold these original patriarchal, capitalist, white supremacist ideas and reform it, because they are going to fight back. They do things quietly and intentionally. And as long as they're in control of who gets in power, even if you get a few people of color in there, those people of color had to subscribe to these white supremacist and capitalist ideas to get there. A really good example of reform not working is the 13th Amendment. It was supposed to be an abolition of slavery, but they added a clause so that it was reforming slavery and turning it from something where individual white people would be human trafficking black people. Now it's the state and the prison industrial complex. And soon after that, you have an increase in laws about loitering, so now you can arrest black people for just standing around, and felons can't vote, so then you're controlling the vote. You add laws about who can vote. You need to be grandfathered in, you need to be literate, you need to own land. Being homeless is now illegal. All of these laws are now created to put people back into chattel slavery. So because of the people in power upholding these ideas, unless you could just get them all out and restart with new people, reform can't go fast enough that these people aren't going to be pushing laws that bring you right back to where you started.
What we see in costuming is this situation of people looking at something like the suffragette movement, something that on the surface looks this feminist empowering thing, and these very recognizable, the dresses and the colors and the sashes, and people really wanting to separate it from all of this history because this history makes them uncomfortable, because it's not fun to think about, because it maybe doesn't make you think very highly of people you used to idolize, because it maybe goes contrary to what you were taught, maybe because it makes you feel less good about yourself.
Yeah.
If you think about that, and then you think about yourself wanting to wear this dress, it doesn't make you feel good about yourself.
And I see a lot of people hear things like this and want to just fully disengage and be like, okay, well, I'm not going to wear it. But as I was bringing it to other time periods, you can't get away from the history. I would love to see people just engage with it in a way that is anti-racist and isn't pushing harmful ideas, because if you're trying to get away from harmful, oppressive systems, you're going to have a hard time.
You're not going to be able to do it.
You can't even wear modern clothes and get away from those ideas.
If you want to wear 100% ethically produced clothes, good luck, you're probably gonna need a sheep farm.
Individual people didn't invent this system, and even if you participate in it or have participated in it unintentionally, that doesn't make you the most evil person in the world. That makes you a person who exists and is probably doing their best.
We have no choice but to live in the world we're in.
I would so much rather see people dressing up in historical clothing and engaging in giving mutual aid and doing activism than completely disengaging. What I want people to take away from this is not that history is bad and scary and you should leave it alone, but that history is incredibly interesting and multifaceted and something that we should learn from and study.
I'm white, but I'm Jewish, and that means that a lot of things about mainstream American culture don't click for me. One of the things that frequently doesn't click for me is that it almost seems like mainstream American culture cares a lot more about looking like you're doing the right thing than actually doing the right thing. There's this scene in the show The Nevers where like this charity organization is brought in to donate to better the lives of these people who have magically unusual attributes or powers. And part of it is, oh, we're gonna invite these people to this tea party. And it's almost like these upper class British people are like, oh yes, we'll donate to this orphanage to take care of them. But we're very uncomfortable at the idea of actually being in the same room as them.
Yeah, that's why we're pushing this idea of sitting with your discomfort and seeing what you can do that actually aligns with your values and morals, because that is doing some amount of internal work versus just trying to uphold an outer image of morality.
And I think that's why it seems like so much work for people who are looking around like, suddenly there's all of this conversation about anti-racism and I have to look like I'm doing the right thing, and what if people judge me? It's a lot less work to sort of redirect into, okay, well, what are my values? It doesn't feel like work.
Yep.
If you're thinking about a historical style and its context and feeling like you want to disconnect from that context and that history, then you already know something about that history is wrong, it was hurtful to people, is making you uncomfortable. Listen to that discomfort. That discomfort is not saying you're a bad person, it's saying the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to follow it through in the right direction. Thank you all very much for joining us for The Suffragettes Were Racist Part 2. I would like to once again thank Ora for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Where can the good people find you around the internet?
I am Ora Lin on YouTube, Ora_Lin on Instagram, and with 2 underscores on TikTok, although I'm not on TikTok much.
And you can find me obviously here, and then on the rest of the internet at Miss SnappyDragon, Instagram and TikTok. If you want the reference notes from this video, you can find those on my Patreon, patreon.com/SnappyDragonStudios, which will include both the sources Ora dug up and all of mine. I will write all of those up for you. Tell us down in the comments about an outfit you remember that is transformed by context. And also, wave hi to my comment moderators. They're making sure that the comments stay a nice place for us to hang out in.
Bye.
Bye. That
Wait,
was so awkward. We're gonna have to cut.
That was really awkward.
Okay, I'm turning the camera off.